the top here, it says, impossible to put down. Stephen King said that. Well, Stephen King is a liar. Hey everyone, it's Mia, and today I'm going to be talking about all the books I read in July. So this month I read 11 books, and yeah, let's get right into the wrap up. So the first book I read was The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F by Mark Manson. I read it as an audiobook, and you've probably seen this book around. It's like insanely popular. I was surprisingly impressed by this book. I wanted to give it a try because I knew it was really popular, but I went into it thinking that it was about, you know, not caring about anything, but the book is more about making sure that your priorities are right and that you're caring about the important stuff. So I actually really did enjoy listening to it. I thought the advice was good. I really liked the narrator for the audiobook. I think he did a really good job of reflecting the personality within the book. And I did enjoy how there were anecdotes and stories of other people that kind of supported his claims. One thing I will say though is that some of Mark Manson's personal anecdotes kind of annoyed me. Like, for example, he discusses his first girlfriend that cheated on him and his stalker. I just didn't really like them. I don't really know how to explain why, because I mean, he does have legitimate reasons for portraying those two people in a negative light, but I just didn't really appreciate those as much. But overall, it was actually really good, and if you've thought about checking that book out, then you should. I mean, I personally liked it, but I know that some people don't. It's popular, but some people really don't like it at the same time, so yeah. So I ended up giving this book 4 stars. So the next book I read was called Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. So this is about a girl called Frances who is the head girl at her school, and she's really academic and her dream is to get into Cambridge. At the same time, she has this secret hobby of making fan art for this podcast called Universe City, and basically it's about her meeting the creator of that podcast and becoming friends with him, and his name is Aled. So I gave this book 3 stars. I liked it. I liked the writing style. I also really liked the friendship between Aled and Frances. I think it was good to have like a platonic relationship between a girl and a boy. And also I think that all of the characters were well done. Like even the side characters, I think they were all really well done. One thing I particularly liked was how this book discusses the disillusionment with academics and university. I mean, I personally appreciated this. I feel like everyone has a point in their lives when they kind of realize, maybe this whole education system isn't as great as you thought it was. That being said, I do think that the whole disillusionment theme / idea is kind of rushed towards the end and kind of presented really obviously. Some people might have a problem with this, some people might not, but in my personal preference, I do like the ideas to be a bit more subtle. But otherwise, you know, I thought it was good. The only reason why I didn't rank this book higher is that it didn't really have much of a personal impact on me. As I said before, I did appreciate the disillusionment stuff, but other than that, I didn't feel particularly connected to any of the other ideas or struggles within the story, so I was just kind of a bit ambivalent about the rest of it, unfortunately. But other than that, it's a good book.
Okay, so I lost the footage for this book, but the third book I read was Girl Mogul by Tiffany Pham. Now this is a self-help book targeted at girls who are probably younger than me. Basically, it's just about how to chase and achieve your dreams. And while it is definitely motivational and the author is an inspiring person, I think that a lot of the advice is pretty obvious, and her own personal anecdotes do make the road to success seem pretty easy. Like, she doesn't really talk about all the hard work and the little failures that you would come across while chasing your dreams. Overall, it's still a pretty positive book, so I gave it 3 stars.
Now, the 4th book that I read this month was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So this book is basically about Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters, and they all need to marry well because their father's estate is going to a random cousin. So then this guy called Mr. Bingley, who's super rich, moves nearby, and people want to marry him, but it's also about his friend who is really rude, but he's also super rich, and he's called Mr. Darcy. Yeah, it's basically about the Bennet sisters and those two rich bachelors and some other drama in there. It's a really fun book. So I gave this book 4 stars. I did make a whole video about this book, and I had a mini review in there which mentioned that I don't know how to rate this, but at the moment it is 4 stars, but I really enjoyed it. So why do I like it so much? It is surprisingly really easy to read. Once you get used to the writing style, if you're not really much of a classics person like I am, it's still really easy to read, it's still really accessible, and it's really fun. It made me laugh out loud, and it's just a really good story. Like, it's never boring because there's so much that happens, and it's not just one plot thread about Lizzie and Mr. Darcy. It's about a lot of stuff, and it's just a really satisfying read. So you should read it. So that was really aggressive, but if you've wanted to read Pride and Prejudice but you've just been a bit afraid to, I definitely encourage you to do so. And as soon as I finished this book, I went online and ordered like 3 more Austen books. I'm gonna read the whole bibliography, I believe, unless it turns out that I really hate the other books, but I don't think that will be the case. So the next book I read was called Punk 57 by Penelope Douglas. So Punk 57 is about this boy called Misha and this girl called Ryan, and they have been pen pals since they were young. And then one day Misha goes to Ryan's school under a different name, and Misha knows who Ryan is, but Ryan doesn't know who Misha is. And basically they hate each other. Ryan hates Misha because he's rude, but Misha hates Ryan because he feels like she's not true to herself, and the person she is on the inside isn't reflected on the outside. Like at high school, she's a really mean cheerleader. So I gave this book 2.5 stars, and this book prompted the realization that maybe Penelope Douglas isn't for me, because I swear I mentioned this book in like all of my recent videos, but recently I read Birthday Girl and I really liked it. But comparing that book to Punk 57 and Credence, I realized that maybe I like Birthday Girl because it's actually pretty wholesome and the other books aren't. Like Punk 57 is intense. Basically, it's a hate to love book, but like it's intense hate to love. And I always say to myself, oh, I can read intense hate to love. But then when I actually read it, I think I just kind of get a little bit scarred. The thing is, it's really hard to critique this book because I think that even though the characters within the book do bad things, and even though they treat each other horribly, it's all justified as much as it could be. Like if I was personally writing this book, there's no way I could justify it more, in my opinion. So I think that it's more a case of this book being perfect for hardcore hate to love fans, but for me, who prefers more wholesome hate to love books, I think it's just not my thing. Okay, so you know how I just said that I like wholesome hate to love books? Well, I'm about to really contradict myself, because the next book that I read was Captive Prince by C.S. Pacat. Now, this book is basically about this dude called Damon, who is the Prince of Achelos, and he is betrayed by his brother and turned into a slave, and then sent as a slave in disguise to the enemy country called Via, and he's sent there as a gift to be the slave of the prince of the enemy country. So while Damon is there, he can't let anyone know who he is, otherwise they'd kill him if they knew he was a prince. Okay, so I loved this book. I read it in 2 nights and I gave it 4.5 stars, which was almost 5 stars. So why do I like this book so much? I really like the writing. I think the writing style is nice, and it reminds me of Murray Rukowski's writing style, who wrote The Winner's Curse. I think there are actually a lot of similarities between Captive Prince and the Winner's Curse trilogy. One of them being that, I mean, they have similar writing styles, but they also are really good at writing like political intrigue and mind games and all these convoluted mysteries. And they're also really great at writing characters. Like in Captive Prince, the two princes are really strong characters. Like, oh my god, like I would probably die for them. Well, maybe not die, but I think they were very strong. It's surprising how much I liked this book, especially when I just complained about Punk 57. But this book is quite graphic and it's got a lot of immoral stuff in it. Like, before you read it, I really encourage you to read the trigger warnings. It is a fantasy, so like, our societal norms are thrown out the window, so just be aware of that. Like, when I was reading it, even though I had seen the trigger warnings, it still took me a moment to adjust. But that being said, I do think that the next 2 books in the trilogy are a lot more milder. The only reason why I didn't give this book 5 stars is because I thought that it didn't really have a good resolution, but I know why that is. It's because when this was originally written, it was written as like one larger story, but then when it was published, it was split up to be separate volumes. So yeah, so I can't really fault the book, but yeah. So then the next book that I read was Prince's Gambit by C.S. Pacat. This is the second book in the trilogy. I literally binged this series. This book I gave 4.5 stars, and I can't really describe the plot without spoiling it because, you know, it's the second book in a series. I will say that I liked this book slightly less because it focuses on a different thing. So the first book is more about court intrigue and all the court mysteries at the palace, whereas this book is more about going on battles and riding horses. I'm less interested in the whole military stuff, but other than that, like, it was still a fun read. And then the next book I read was King's Rising by C.S. Pacat, and this was the third book in the trilogy. I gave this book 4.5 stars. I will say that when I was reading it, the last night I was reading it, I procrastinated reading it because I knew that when I finished it, I would be a wreck inside, and I knew that I would probably slip into a reading slump and it would be really depressing. So I kept on putting it off. I was like, no, I can't finish it yet, but I really want to finish it, but I can't. So yeah, I can't really describe the plot. There is one thing I will say though, and it's one of the reasons why I love the Winter's Curse trilogy so much, and that is, there is nothing I love more than personal emotions getting in the way of politics between opposing nations. Oh my god, sorry, I'm acting crazy. Okay, I need to compose myself. I'm just saying, if you think that you can handle the content within this series, you should read it because I really liked it. So you know how I just talked about how excited I was for that trilogy? Well, now we're going to get a bit depressing and talk about the 9th book I read, which was Ninth House. 9th book, 9th House. This book is about Alex Stern, who receives a full ride to Yale, but there's a catch. She has to be part of this club called Leaf, which is a club that, well, a society that looks after the other societies of Yale. But they're just not normal societies, they're magical societies. And in this book there's a murder and Alex thinks it has something to do with the magical societies. Now, I gave this book 3 stars. Objectively, this is a good book. Like, I think that Leigh Bardugo's writing, like her prose, is really excellent. I love her descriptions and her similes and her metaphors, and I want them. In a technical sense, the characters are strong as well. Like, I can't really fault it. Subjectively, I just couldn't make myself care. I just didn't have any personal interest in it. So reading it felt like a chore. Like, at the beginning, it was really slow, and I was like, I'll just be optimistic, maybe it'll get better. But like, it never got better. And I just was never interested in it, and I never felt compelled to keep reading. You know, up the top here, it says, impossible to put down. Stephen King said that. Well, Stephen King is a liar, because I put this down probably like 100 times. The next book I read was Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Now, this book is basically about this girl who's 17 years old called Catherine Morland, and she is invited by Mr. and Mrs. Allen, who are just random family friends, to go to Bath and to hang out there, make some friends, and that's basically what it's about. Now, I gave this book 3 stars, and I will tell you why. Maybe the main negative is my own fault, because I went into this book thinking it was about Northanger Abbey. If you've had other people describe this book, they will say it's about Catherine Morland going to Northanger Abbey, which is true, but she doesn't go to Northanger Abbey until like halfway through the book. Like, you have to read a lot before then. I really did like the first 100 pages about her hanging out in Bath, but then it gets a bit boring in the middle and not much happens, and then she goes to Northanger Abbey and a little bit happens, and then a lot suddenly happens in the end. So my main gripe is that maybe I had weird expectations going into this book because I thought it would be about one thing, but it wasn't really about that until halfway through the book, but also because I feel like the pacing was kind of weird. I can't help comparing this book to Pride and Prejudice. I think that Catherine is like a fine protagonist, but I didn't really care much for the other characters, and I feel like the plot wasn't as developed as Pride and Prejudice. I think my main issue is that Pride and Prejudice is full of story, like so much happens and you're never bored, whereas I feel like this book doesn't have enough story to sustain it. And it was so sad because I really wanted to like it. Like, I went into it knowing that it was meant to be a satire of like gothic novels. I mean, it was funny. There were a lot of funny moments, but I just didn't like it as much as Pride and Prejudice, which was depressing. Okay, we're finally up to the last book that I read this month, called Zero at the Bone by Jane Saville. And this is basically about this guy called Jack Francisco, who is a doctor and he witnesses a murder, so he has to be put into witness protection. At the same time, there's this hitman called D, that's all you know him as, who is basically blackmailed into finding Jack Francisco and killing him. And I say blackmailed because D isn't like other hitmen. He's different, as in he has a semblance of morality. I gave this book 3 stars. I think the first third was excellent, but as I continued reading, I think the book just got worse and worse. Let's talk about the good stuff. I think that at the beginning, the 2 characters have a lot of potential. I think that D is really strong because, I mean, that just automatically comes with this character. He's a hitman, how did he get that way? And all of his morality. I think that Jack has potential at the beginning, and I do appreciate how his strengths are demonstrated because he is a doctor, so that comes into play. So yeah, I do think that the first third is really action-packed. However, in this book there is a romance, and the romance, in my opinion, gets rushed, and as soon as it happens, it means that a source of the tension within the novel disappears. I think the third act is far too long. I think there's the climax, and then there's like 20 other climaxes after that. I think that the last chapter and the epilogue definitely could have been cut. And another thing is that I think that Jack could have had a character arc. So those are all the books that I read in July. Let me know if you've read any of the books I mentioned in this video down in the comments below and what you thought of them. And if you want to see more videos from me about reading or writing, then consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching, bye!